There are a lot of different levels of depression or despair. We might start with sad, go to depressed, despair, hopeless. These are all words we don't want to hear, and we certainly don't want to feel them. And yet we find lots of people in the scriptures who were sad, depressed, in despair, or even felt hopeless. Around us in this world we live in, we find people in the same levels. Some that are just sad, some that are depressed, some that are in despair, and some that feel like it's hopeless. And as a matter of fact, I've read of a number of cases where people felt so hopeless that they took their own lives. That's a terrible hopelessness. Depression is a terrible thing. Despair is even worse, and hopelessness is certainly beyond my imagination. Nevertheless, we find in the scriptures Cain, Job, Elijah, and Paul. Just a few of the ones that had feelings of sadness or depression or despair or hopelessness. And yet each one of them has something in common. You say, my goodness, what could they have in common? We find people of great faith to people that actually turned against and didn't show any remorse towards what they had done, like Cain. How could they all have something in common? Well, the one thing they all had in common is they took their despair, their depression, their hopelessness, their sadness to God. And it's interesting to see in each case how God took care of it. Cain took to God, and when God gave him his punishment for killing his brother, he said, "It's too great for me." Interesting little passage in chapter 4, verse 15 in the book of Genesis. Let me say that again for you, because you're going to want to go look at it, as I did the second time today. Genesis 4:15. It not only tells Cain that God promised that nobody would kill him, because God said he would take vengeance sevenfold over anybody that harmed him, but it says he put a mark on Cain. Maybe you've heard that phrase, the mark of Cain. But nobody really knows what that mark was. Nobody knows if that's figurative or literal. Nobody seems to know exactly what that mark was. Somehow God was communicating to the world around Cain, if you touch this man, I will take vengeance against you, so you dare not. Interesting, isn't it? That Cain would be spared from the very same fate that he took of his brother, because God is a God of mercy and grace. And Cain took his problem to God, and God took care of his problem. Then we find the story of Job. It's a horrible story. I mean, he loses everything. He loses family and possessions. And it goes on for chapters upon chapters of his wife and others misunderstanding him and misunderstanding why these things have happened to Job, until you get to the very last chapter, chapter 42, verse 10. And it says that God would restore to Job twofold everything that he had. And it tells us in verse 12 that we'd be blessed more in his latter days than in his former days. It's really quite an interesting passage of scripture. So we see then that Cain's problems were answered, Job's problems were answered. Elijah, who was so depressed that he hid in the cave and just wished to die, God sent an angel to say, sit up and eat. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? My wife says that I eat when I'm sick. I eat when I've got a fever. I eat when I have a cold. I eat when I'm depressed, and I eat when I'm happy. And then there's Paul. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. And it says he beseeched God to remove the thorn. But listen to what God says to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Power is perfected in weakness. Sad, depressed, despairing, hopeless. Just think what God said to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you. And your power, that is God's power working in you, will be perfected in your weakness. Interesting. Look at that passage of scripture in 2 Corinthians 12:9, and you'll see that it says, and Paul learned to be content. Wonderful passage of scripture. So whether you're depressed, whether you're sad, whether you're in despair, or even if you feel hopeless, remember all of those that have felt it before you in the scriptures took it to God, and God's answer was always sufficient for each of them. That's your thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.